Tutorial 1, Introduction to Flying. This tutorial covers the basic information needed to get you started in your flight training journey, and it is succeeded by a series of tutorials that will provide you with the necessary knowledge to become a licensed pilot. We look forward to helping you along your journey toward the wild blue yonder. From prehistoric times, humans have watched the flight of birds, longed to imitate them, but lacked the power to do so. During the 1500s, Leonardo da Vinci filled pages of his notebooks with sketches of proposed flying machines, but most of his ideas were flawed because he clung to the idea of bird-like wings. The quest for human flight led some practitioners in another direction. In 1783, the first manned hot air balloon, crafted by Joseph and Etienne Montgolfier, flew for 23 minutes. 10 days later, Professor Jacques Charles flew the first gas balloon. Balloons solved the problem of lift, but that was only one of the problems of human flight. The ability to control speed and direction eluded balloonists. The solution to that problem lay in a child's toy, familiar to the East for 2,000 years, but not introduced to the West until the 13th century, the kite. The bicycle-building Wright brothers of Dayton, Ohio, had experimented for 4 years with kites, their own homemade wind tunnel, and different engines to power their biplane. By the afternoon of December 17th, the Wright brothers had flown a total of 98 seconds on 4 flights. The age of flight had arrived. During the early years of manned flight, aviation was a free-for-all because no government body was in place to establish policies or regulate and enforce safety standards. On May 20, 1926, Congress passed the Air Commerce Act, which served as the cornerstone for aviation within the United States. This legislation was supported by leaders in the aviation industry who felt that the airplane could not reach its full potential without assistance from the federal government in improving safety. Equally important for safety was the establishment of a system of certification for aircraft. On May 29, 1927, the Aeronautics branch issued the first airworthiness type certificate to the Buell Airster CA-3, a 3-place open biplane. In 1934, to recognize the tremendous strides made in aviation and to display the enhanced status within the department, the Aeronautics branch was renamed the Bureau of Air Commerce. In 1938, the Civil Aeronautics Act transferred the civil aviation responsibilities to a newly created independent body named the Civil Aeronautics Authority. By mid-century, air traffic had increased, and jet aircraft had been introduced into the civil aviation arena. A series of mid-air collisions underlined the need for more regulation of the aviation industry. The Federal Aviation Act of 1958 established a new independent body that assumed the roles of the CAA and transferred the rulemaking authority to the newly created Federal Aviation Agency. Shortly after, the Federal Aviation Agency was renamed to the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA is empowered by regulations to promote aviation safety and establish safety standards for civil aviation. The FAA achieves these objectives under the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, which is the codification of the general and permanent rules published by the executive departments and agencies of the United States government. The regulations are divided into 50 different codes called titles that represent broad areas subject to federal regulation. FAA regulations are listed under Title 14, Aeronautics and Space, which encompasses all aspects of civil aviation, from how to earn a pilot's certificate to maintenance of an aircraft. Title 14 CFR Chapter 1, Federal Aviation Administration, is broken down into subchapters A through N, as illustrated in the figure. For the pilot, certain parts of 14 CFR are more relevant than others. During flight training, it is helpful for the pilot to become familiar with the parts and subparts that relate to flight training and pilot certification. For instance, 14 CFR Part 61 pertains to the certification of pilots, flight instructors, and ground instructors. It also defines the eligibility, aeronautical knowledge, flight proficiency, as well as training and testing requirements for each type of pilot certificate issued. 14 CFR Part 91 provides guidance in the areas of general flight rules, visual flight rules, VFR, and instrument flight rules, IFR, while 14 CFR Part 43 covers aircraft maintenance, preventive maintenance, rebuilding, and alterations. The FAA, in concert with other government agencies, orchestrates the publication and changes to publications that are key to safe flight. In addition to the regulations provided online by the FAA, several other publications are available to the user. Almost all reference material is available online in downloadable format. The Aeronautical Information Manual, AIM, is the official guide to basic flight information and ATC procedures for the aviation community flying in the National Airspace System of the United States. The AIM also contains information of interest to pilots, such as health and medical facts, flight safety, a pilot controller glossary of terms used in the system, and information on safety, accidents, and reporting of hazards. Handbooks are developed to provide specific information about a particular topic that enhances training or understanding. The FAA publishes a variety of handbooks that generally fall into three categories: aircraft, aviation, and examiners and inspectors. Aircraft flight manuals, commonly called Pilot Operating Handbooks, POH, are documents developed by the airplane manufacturer, approved by the FAA, and are specific to a particular make and model aircraft by serial number. Advisory circulars, ACs, provide a single, uniform, agency-wide system that the FAA uses to deliver advisory material to FAA customers, industry, the aviation community, and the public. Notices to Airmen, NOTAMs, time-critical aeronautical information. NOTAMs contain current notices to airmen, which are considered essential to the safety of flight. Aircraft types and categories. Ultralight vehicles do not require any form of pilot license or certification if they are flown within 14 CFR 103 operating rules, which generally limit the ultralight vehicle to uncontrolled airspace and no flight over populated areas. In 2004, the FAA approved a new pilot certificate and aircraft category program to allow individuals to join the aviation community by reducing training requirements that affect the overall cost of learning to fly. The Sport Pilot Certificate was created for pilots flying lightweight, simple aircraft and offers limited privileges. The type of intended flying will influence what type of pilot certificate is required. Eligibility, training, experience, and testing requirements differ depending on the type of certificate sought. A private pilot is one who flies for pleasure or personal business. Passengers may be carried, and flight in furtherance of a business is permitted. However, a private pilot may not be compensated in any way for services as a pilot, although passengers can pay a pro rata share of flight expenses, such as fuel or rental costs. A commercial pilot may be compensated for flying. Training for the certificate focuses on a better understanding of aircraft systems and a higher standard of airmanship. A commercial airplane pilot must be able to operate a complex airplane, and at least a portion of the practical examination is performed in a complex aircraft. A complex aircraft must have retractable landing gear, movable flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller. The airline transport pilot is tested to the highest level of piloting ability. The ATP certificate is a prerequisite for acting as a pilot in command of scheduled airline operations. The minimum pilot experience is 1,500 hours of flight time. In addition, the pilot must be at least 23 years of age. Selection of a flight school is an important consideration in the flight training process. FAA-approved flight schools, non-certificated flying schools, and independent flight instructors conduct flight training in the United States, following the regulations outlined in either 14 CFR Part 141 or 61. 14 CFR Part 141 flight schools are certificated by the FAA. Enrollment in a 14 CFR Part 141 flight school ensures quality and continuity because these facilities must document the training curriculum and have their flight courses approved by the FAA. These strictures allow 14 CFR Part 141 schools to complete certificates and ratings in fewer flight hours. For example, the minimum requirement for a private pilot certificate is 35 hours in a Part 141 certificated school and 40 hours in Part 61 schools. 14 CFR Part 61 outlines certificate and rating requirements for pilot certification through non-certificated schools and individual flight instructors. One advantage of flight training under 14 CFR Part 61 is its flexibility. Flight lessons can be tailored to the individual student because 14 CFR Part 61 dictates the required minimum flight experience and knowledge-based training necessary to gain a specific pilot's license, but it does not stipulate how the training is to be organized. This flexibility can also be a disadvantage because a flight instructor who fails to organize the flight training can cost a student pilot time and expense through repetitious training. A student pilot is one who is being trained by an instructor pilot for his or her first full certificate and is permitted to fly alone, solo, under specific, limited circumstances. Upon request, an FAA-authorized aviation medical examiner, AME, will issue a combined medical certificate and student pilot certificate after completion of a physical examination. Student pilot certificates may be issued by an FAA inspector or an FAA-designated pilot examiner. To be eligible for a student pilot's certificate, an individual must be 16 years old, be able to read, write, speak, and understand English, hold a current third-class medical certificate. Once the student pilot has shown proficiency in the required knowledge areas, flight maneuvers, and accrued the required amount of flight hours, the Certified Flight Instructor, CFI, endorses the student pilot logbook, which allows the student pilot to take the written and practical exams for pilot certification. The knowledge test is the computer portion of the exams taken to obtain pilot certification. The FAA has hundreds of designated computer testing centers worldwide. Each applicant must register to take the test and provide proper identification and authorization proving eligibility to take a particular FAA test. Upon completion of the knowledge test, the applicant receives an Airman Knowledge Test report that reflects the score and is embossed with the testing center's seal. To pass, a minimum score of 70 must be attained. The FAA has developed Practical Test Standards, PTS, for FAA pilot certificates and associated ratings. The flight proficiency maneuvers listed in 14 CFR Part 61 are the standard skill requirements for certification. They are outlined in the PTS as areas of operation. The candidate is required to demonstrate knowledge and proficiency in all tasks for the original issuance of all pilot certificates. Since the FAA requires all practical tests be conducted in accordance with the appropriate PTS, the pilot applicant should become familiar with this book during training. Descriptions of tasks and information on how to perform maneuvers and procedures are contained in reference and teaching documents such as this handbook. The CFI best determines when an applicant is qualified for the practical test. A practice practical test is an important step in the flight training process. The applicant will be asked to present the following documentation: FAA Form 8710-1, application for an airman certificate and/or rating, with the flight instructor's recommendation. an Airman Knowledge Test report with a satisfactory grade, a medical certificate and a student pilot certificate endorsed by a flight instructor, and the pilot logbook records. The applicant must provide an airworthy aircraft with equipment relevant to the areas of operation required for the practical test. He or she will also be asked to produce and explain the aircraft's registration certificate, aircraft's airworthiness certificate, aircraft's operating limitations or FAA-approved aircraft flight manual if required, aircraft equipment list, required weight and balance data, maintenance records, applicable airworthiness directives. This concludes your introduction to flying. There are many different levels of aviation interest, from recreational and private pilots to commercial and airline transport pilots. Wherever your interests lie, there is one thing that all pilots have in common, and that is the fact that we all continually train and hone our flight skills to be safer and more effective behind the controls.